following preview was begrudgingly approved for all audiences.
You're listening to Elevator Music.
And welcome back to Forward Thinking. I'm Ricky Vellante, joined by my co-host David West. We have another special guest today, Brittany Collens, ranked WTA tennis player, and also has been in the news a little bit lately because of what happened to her at UMass with some wins being vacated by the NCAA. So, Brittany, thanks for joining us today.
No, thank you. I super appreciate being here.
So, how about we just start off? Tell us a little bit about yourself, your career, and ultimately what led you to being at UMass for a couple of seasons there.
Yeah. So I started playing tennis very young, at 5 years old. Trained my whole life and ended up transferring to UMass my sophomore year. Played New Mexico State my first year, and for the last 3 years I've been playing tennis professionally on the WTA tour, traveling around. Of course, things are a little bit slower with the pandemic, but as of recently, like you said, I'm in the news for not a very favorable, I guess, event, but the NCAA has come down on my UMass tennis team and myself, vacating my junior and senior year because I was accidentally compensated for a stipend that would cover a landline phone jack for on-campus student housing. And my junior year, I moved off campus, and somewhere in that year, $252 was lumped in with my scholarship, and it went kind of unnoticed, and it was self-reported by UMass. They figured that out and came to an agreement with the NCAA that this was such a minor mistake, a clerical error. UMass record keeps well for 98% of the time. And an agreement was made that a self-imposed fine of $5,000 and a year or two of probation would be completely just and fine. And unfortunately, the Committee on Infractions came back and said, this isn't enough. These girls had a clear on-court advantage for the $252 or $504 some, and therefore those seasons need to be vacated, both the year that we received the one-time stipend and the year after. So that includes our A10 title, unfortunately, my senior year.
Wow.
What was the perceived advantage? What?
Yeah, I don't know.
So did they not explain that, or is that just I don't know how that works in terms of how much rationalization they give for these decisions. So. Yeah,
honestly, I have no idea because that wasn't really explained clearly, I guess, on their behalf.
Really?
They're just saying any kind of money that's overpaid to athletes affects their amateurism. And once you're overpaid, $1 or $5,000, you're no longer an amateur, and then you can't compete in college sports. And they're saying that it was the responsibility of the school to withhold myself and my other teammate from competition. But the response from our athletic director was that would have been impossible because nobody knew until we reported it, which was, I think, after I graduated. So it's all a little bit irrational.
Yeah, it seems like it.
And it was found in like an audit, like after the fact, right? Like it really had nothing to do with an extra benefit or anything like that, to your point. Like they didn't discover this until literally years later.
Yeah, I think that's like probably the toughest part is that UMass self-reported it in a self-audit, like you said. Like it wasn't like the NCAA knew about it and went digging for it. They just were honest and came forward. And I think they've spent like $100,000, probably more, since that came out like almost a month ago, in defending themselves, because it just doesn't really give any, incentive anymore to self-report, when they give out like the harshest penalty for an offense done without intent, when there's so many offenses done with intent that they don't give out that type of penalty for. So it's unfortunate. I'm so super grateful for UMass for defending us, but I don't want to say I wish they didn't, but there's no win for them. There's no advantage.
Right. What does it do to you to have your work and what you did? And I know I played in the A10 when I was at Xavier, so shout out to the A10. But what is it? Does it make you feel some kind of way having your sort of what you did erased and taken away? What does that feel like?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've gone through a range of emotions throughout this, kind of shocked, not knowing. I read about it in a headline, which is the craziest thing. I had no idea that this was happening until I read about it because somebody sent it to me. So what it does to me, I think, at this point, I know what kind of work my team and I have done. And so they can vacate it and the memories will be there. And I think it's been so comforting that so many people have stood with us throughout this whole process. But I think what really affects me and really hurts me is that they don't realize that it doesn't just affect the team. It goes way beyond to a community that they will never know if they don't, engage with us as the team at all. So, for instance, Friends of UMass Tennis is a mostly retired elderly group that would drive to the airport to meet us after we won the A10, an hour and a half drive, spending their retired time, an important time in their lives to support us. It's people like that. And especially if you think of I was saying to Ricky that our team was super international. And these girls picked up and moved across, the seas to come over and play for an organization that's supposed to protect their college athletes. And then this kind of happens. And you think of families that are on the phone 2 a.m. calling them because they can't talk to their kids. That's what hurts. It's like you're saying you're going to erase your college career. And it's like, well, it's the dedication of other people.
In terms of like due process, which in the prep session you and I were talking about, technically the NCAA does not owe coaches or its athletes due process. At any point, did you get to interact with one of the infractions officers? Was there an interview? Anything?
No, this is what's really bothering me and what I'm realizing. I just don't understand how there's no due process. Like, how is that possible that you can punish somebody for something and they can't even defend themselves? The closest I've come to interacting with the COI is that I reached out to an NCAA SAC representative from the Division I committee and asked them to ask questions on my behalf. Why are we grouped in with basketball? Why are they giving out the biggest punishment when they haven't done that for other cases? And the answers were not any comforting at all. That's the closest I've come. I would love to just put a face to things and put my face to things and speak to the NCAA, but I don't really foresee that happening because it sounds like they don't want us to be a part of it at all. So unfortunate.
Yeah, they certainly don't. Infractions officers rarely avail themselves throughout the process or even after the process. So it's unfortunate. But putting a positive spin on this, though, you've been able to take this opportunity now and try to put your energy towards positive change within the college sports space. Tell us a little bit about not only the people that have reached out to you, but the opportunities that have been presented as a result of this unfortunate situation.
Yeah, I mean, I've been so blessed to be reached out by so many, well-educated people in this regard to help me along. As I said, I've kind of been thrown into the middle of it, and I probably was a little bit oblivious to this kind of things before this happened to us, and so I'm grateful that I'm now being educated. But early on, Senator Murphy of Connecticut, his team had reached out to me when they had retweeted the Blossoming Globe article and said that they have been long pushing for NCAA reform and that they would love to involve me, and so super grateful for that. And then as of recently, Representative from Massachusetts, Stephen Howitt, has introduced that they are going to propose the NIL bill modeled after California and Florida, and that they would also like to use our story a little bit different because obviously we don't benefit from the NIL bill in this situation, but it goes along with the lines of amateurism. So any way I can kind of help push those forward so that college athletes can gain some sort of control, I'm happy to do so.
The interesting and unfortunate thing about these NIL bills, though, is at least the way that Florida and California have been crafted is that if this were to happen again, it wouldn't actually solve this problem. Yeah, because it would be a payment from the institution to the athlete, and that's something that's still explicitly impermissible in all these state bills. That's unfortunate. But so my other question in this context, and this is something that I've gotten a bit, and you may not have since you're still new to this, but for you, what sort of duty in a way do you feel, or obligation do you feel like having? Because, as a white athlete in a country club sport, playing in a system that primarily exploits Black athletes to the benefit of those, like how does that resonate with you? And what is that, like I said, the duty or obligation that you feel like that may create to represent these people that are underrepresented or not represented at all in this process?
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to be a great ally, and I recognize that I do have somewhat of a responsibility here having the mic. It's not always, that the media does, get attention to some of the smaller women's sports, things like that. And I just want to best educate myself, talking to Taylor Branch yesterday on the phone, who obviously has been long, involved in this, just asking him, let's go back in history and see, how we got to this point. And that's really what I'm trying to do. And, as many people as I can talk to that can, educate me on everything, the exploitation of athletes I think is going to be helpful for me because, it's been a month, but I've been really trying to best educate myself on this, and I just want to be a great representative for everyone.
I want to go back to a point you made about the punishment without process, but then also just talk about that disconnect that exists because you then, just when you finished up just talking just now, you were talking about how there needs to be, at least from what I'm getting, it needs to be a little bit more connectedness, right, to the whole system. And we're against the exploitation of athletes, and we believe in compensation as a starting point. But for folks who aren't quite there, yet, can you talk about some of the steps you think might need to be taken in just a short term, like from your experience now that you're having the disconnected nature of, and I've always felt like, so you have like these people in suits and these people that handle like the bureaucracy of the NCAA, and they're completely disconnected from what's going on inside the locker rooms, what's going on with the athletes, and even the coaches. I'll give the coaches a break in the fact that some coaches are sort of on the side of like they're in the grind, right, and they're connected to the players and are developing relationships with the players. But I just want to talk about that. Like, can you answer? Can you sort of speak on that, this weird space that it exists where you have this group of folks that are in charge, that are making rules and decisions, and at the same time they're not really connected to those that are being affected, by those decisions.
Yeah, this is my biggest problem. And every time I speak to someone, I say, how do we fix the fact that the NCAA is both the judge and the rule maker, and they're not impartial at all to this process because they care a great deal about making money. And I just don't understand, their literal headline is, "We will protect the college athletes." And then they slap a huge punishment on us. And then they don't even have, any, decency to call us about it or talk to us or even let us participate. Why don't they want to hear what we have to say? That's not somebody who cares about their athletes. So what I really, and it's not a small thing, I think there really needs to be an independent group that is policing the NCAA and the colleges and the athletic programs, because it has to be independent. Because the problem is college athletes, if they have an issue with their coach, with their team, with their school or the NCAA, there is no safe haven. There's no place for them to go report it, because the chances are they're just going to be further, victimized, because there's no, or take a risk and talk to the media, in which the NCAA still has control. So for me, it's really redistributing the money to find ways to give the power back to the athletes. And that starts with the, NIL, which is probably not perfect, or not enough at this point, but it's a step forward, right? And then hopefully something with Congress, and then it will become a federal thing. And I just think giving rights back to college athletes is the most important thing, because we're set up in a system in which we don't have rights. And if there are problems, we don't have any other option to quit our sport and give up our college education, or just withstand it. And it's unfortunate.
Right.
Yeah, there was just, I don't remember the exact details, but there was just a report from one of the Cal students that opted out, got his bill, opted out of the season, and just got his, I think it was like a $21,000 tuition bill for this semester. So, and most people, not just most athletes, but most people can't cut that check. But especially a lot of the athletes, the backgrounds, the demographics, all that, certainly can't afford these checks without that athletic scholarship. So
or say that something doesn't go wrong and you actually have a great college experience, but you get injured. There's no obligation for your scholarship to be renewed, at all. So like, even to people who have a great experience, there's things that really need to be worked on.
Yeah, certainly. As David and I have talked about plenty of times before, I had Tommy John surgery and then also stretched my labrum in college. But fortunately, my mom had a good insurance policy, or else we would have been in a much different place.
Mm.
So it's very true, though, and that's where the employment status and the rights that these athletes is so critical. And as you know, we were fortunate to have Senator Murphy last week, or 2 weeks ago now, come and join us and talk about his vision for moving forward federally.
Yeah, I hope I can help with that in any way possible.
Yeah, so I've got two more questions, my last two. So the first one will be, can you just, for some of the athletes that may be listening, can you just talk about the difference between an individual, like what you feel as an individual sport athlete, being a tennis player, that maybe players like myself I've been a lifelong team sport guy, some of the differences, or what's like the difference between playing a team sport and playing an individual sport like tennis? And then the second part of my question will be your routine. Like what do you do for young athletes, someone listening who's juggling a lot of stuff, school and all this other stuff. What's the most important thing you do in terms of your routine to start your day to make sure you get things off to a good start? And maybe something that you've done since college, or maybe something that you picked up in the last few years or whatever.
Yeah. So for your first question, I think college tennis in general is awesome for tennis players because it's the first time you get to really kind of play on a team, for a long period of time.
Right.
And it is different in a way that I probably recognize it's still very, very competitive, as playing on a basketball team. But when you have tennis and you're playing for your positions, it can be quite competitive, especially, with females. And you win and lose together as a team, but it's always very clear who loses the matches, or
Right.
what I mean? So if you have a bad day, like you win and lose together as a team, but it's just really different in that regard. It's not always a cumulative of everything. It may come down just to one person. And so, everybody has bad days. So it's different in that regard, but it's so nice college tennis because you grow up by yourself, really playing by yourself. And now I'm back by myself, which has been the hardest thing. The transition on the tour is going from having a team to being by yourself is really hard. But nonetheless, it's just a great opportunity. And for your second question, I have to write things down, and I'm a huge planner. But I work with my mental strength coach, and he always says, have a plan that is, stealing his quote here, firmly chiseled in jello. And what he means by that is that be detailed and be willing to continually adapt, because things happen. And when you're so rigid and you plan all the time, like, you won't be, able to make those changes. And so I'm stealing his quote for that. But that's what keeps me kind of on track, is writing down and making, adjustments all the time.
Nice. I appreciate that. It's a great answer.
Absolutely.
That's definitely a different one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that one, because I was somebody that was really rigid, but I've learned it's better to keep things, changing all the time, change up the routines, or else you get bored and you get burned out.
Right. Good deal.
Especially trying to play tennis during the pandemic. Like, this whole year, nothing's gone to plan, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, I've taken up a whole new set of interests here, doing different things every day for fitness, and just trying to keep it interesting, because it's tough not competing for long time, since March.
Right.
Well, Brittany, we really appreciate your time and appreciate you joining us.
No, thank you. Really appreciate it. And please feel free to reach back out to me at any time.
You got some fans at the PCL.
Yep. Thank you for your time.
And welcome back to Forward Thinking. I'm Ricky Vellante, joined by my co-host, David West. With us today, we have another special guest, Dr. Janet Taylor, a psychiatrist and mother of four. Janet, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Ricky. I'm glad to be here. David?
Yeah, so you wear a lot of hats. So how about we start off with just giving us a little bit of your background and what all you do on a daily basis?
Wow. Okay. So I'm a psychiatrist, went undergrad in med school, University of Louisville, did a psych residency in New York Valhalla, Westchester division, and have primarily worked in underserved communities my whole career. Worked at Harlem Hospital for 12 years, and then worked with cases in New York City, worked at Rikers. So my whole career, so to speak, has been working with individuals criminal justice involved, substance abuse involved, and moved to Florida 3 years ago where I continue to do the same thing. I run medication assistant therapy program for people addicted to opiates, and then comprehensive treatment court team where we have successfully been able to keep people, mostly with misdemeanor, some felonies, out of jail by providing housing, food, all those basic needs that people need, and then psychiatric services and treatment to help them re-enter society as they should.
And you've also had the opportunity through this to work with some, anti-racism consulting, culture change consulting. How all has that come about, and what specifically do you do in that space?
So in medicine, I've done a lot with cultural competence in terms of trying to, and now cultural humility, to improve the doctor-patient relationship when the doctor or patient is of a different ethnicity. And so that's naturally evolved into what's going on now with the two pandemics of COVID-19, which highlighted ethnic disparities, racial disparities, flat out structural racism in America, and structural racism in corporations. And now corporations really want to hear from their employees of color about how they're doing within the companies. And we know that if you're an employee of color, and basically no matter what ism you are, whether it's sexism, gender, sexual orientation, how you feel, what you have to go through the day to day before you get to work is certainly how you feel within that company. So talking about racism, more importantly, anti-racism and allyship in an attempt not to just have words, but to create some change within organizations, which would include boards, which would include executive leadership, and certainly continuing conversations about what it means to be other in America and the impact that has on psychological health of employees. But we know that more diverse companies are more productive financially. We know women make better managers and leaders. So it's just an opportunity to elevate the conversation about the benefit of certainly equality, knowing that, no matter how woke, even though I don't really like that word, but how woke, white people say they are, 50% of them, when you start talking about equality, they feel like you're taking something away from them. So how can we change that conversation as we have the potential now to create a new humanity where we just treat people the way they should be treated? And it's certainly necessary.
Hey, Dr. Taylor, can I ask you to expand a little bit on the anti-racism piece? That's a phrase or a collection of words that's come about in the last few years, and so for our audience, can you just talk about that a little bit and what that means specifically, and then sort of what the work is, aligned with that?
Sure, David. So to talk about that, we have to talk about the race, right? And we know that race is a social construct, and especially in America. I mean, 1619, Africans were brought here against their will, served as unpaid labor. And it was in two colonies, Maryland and Virginia, that white people basically said, we're going to use race, the color of their skin and the color of our skin, to develop this myth of white supremacy, that white people are superior and that black people, black skin needs us. Scientific racism emerged from that standpoint. And during that time, race has been used to really create racism, which is just who has power, who has resources, and that's embedded at every structural level, every interaction basically in America. So Angela Davis actually was one of the first people that said, it's not enough to be non-racist, you must be anti-racist, which means to be anti-racist, you examine basically every interaction you have, every policy, look at who's at the table, who's not at the table, in an attempt, as Ibram Kendi said, to dismantle racism. So anti-racism, it should not be, a word, it's a verb, it's active, but it really means that white people, people of color, everybody has to look at their identity, look at their interactions, and really create policies and changes, knowing that racism is explicit, it's conscious, it's deliberate, which is different from implicit bias, which is unconscious. But when someone is racist, then they mean to hurt and they mean to divide. And so anti-racism really has to look at everything that we do and really, create policies, give space, not just give money, but look at changing things. And so, it looks at white privilege and all those things that makes people feel uncomfortable, but we have to, and they have to really look at just the history of racism in this country and how destructive it has been. And I mean, it's just evidenced in everything we do. So, but to be anti-racist means you basically look at every interaction you're doing and policies, who's not there, and you make a deliberate effort to change it.
Right. Yeah. That again, that's something that, and I know, Dr. Kendi has been, vocal about it, and it's been a phrase that has sort of caught on in the last couple of years. So I thought it was good for just for our audience to get a
Yeah.
definition.
Yeah, and I mean, look at the work Wendell's doing, professional golf in terms of getting people Lee Elder recognized, looking at who's not seen and who's not visible. I mean that, and then getting the PGA to make those changes certainly is an example of anti-racist action, but it has to be continued because there's so much to be done here. But it's a start.
In a lot of ways, the pandemic has heightened the focus on many of these things. Obviously, what the PCL does working in the college sports space, we're seeing primarily persons of color driving revenue to institutions operated by primarily white administrators and coaches in the midst of a pandemic, literally risking their lives. You referenced at the beginning here that you do work with some athletes, especially youth athletes, and how this period has potentially impacted their identity and what you're doing with them to mitigate some of the risks that they may be facing from a mental health standpoint.
Yes, so I've had the good fortune to work with 3 ex-NFL players, Rob Robertson, Claude Harriott, and Ricky, blanking on his last name, who have for the past year been going into inner city schools in DC and motivating them, teaching them life skills. And they partnered with the DC Athletic Association and have created Zoom calls now because of COVID that certainly are meant to address these athletes' mental health, which is suffering because not only educationally, where a lot of athletes were at risk anyway, just by the nature of the schools that they're in, not saying anything about their academic potential, but just by virtue of the school systems. And now with seeing, let's say, football as an opportunity to, get a scholarship, to get exposure on a college campus and to further their lives, that's being curtailed because their season has been cut off because of COVID-19. And my brother played at Duke in basketball. He coaches with Johnny Dawkins at UCF, and they get tested twice a day for COVID. Some of their players can't play, and I really think we have to look at what's happening to our athletes, in particular of color, who may have risk. If you have a history of sickle cell disease, which 100,000 people in America, Black people, have to this day, that's an increased risk factor for COVID-19 in terms of dying from it. We know a number of athletes who have issues and or concerns about COVID-19 and being around their families, where they may have family members who may have pre-existing conditions. And so the fact that these athletes having COVID-19 are still being allowed to play or interact, maybe not being quarantined enough, and the potential loss of life that could happen, knowing that, COVID-19 can impact not only respiratory, but more importantly, cardiovascular, and what that means. And my question is, does the NCAA need to shut it down until they can do echocardiograms on every single player who has tested positive for COVID-19 and really want to take a liability and say, if anything happens to them, we'll take responsibility? But I mean, at what point do we say, sports, no, it's big business, but it's entertainment. Is somebody's life worth, some alumni or some fan, wanting to choose Michigan over Michigan State? And I think, if you look at who's most at risk, it's Black men. And I think we really need to examine that and demand that they have more rigorous, evidence-based medical testing before people are cleared.
Yeah, and I know a couple weekends ago or last weekend, we had obviously the situation with Keontae Johnson, which I know yesterday they said seems to be doing better, which is great to hear. But simultaneously, while that's been happening, we've had writers at The Athletic, CBS Sports, who within the last 48 hours have started releasing pieces talking about the athlete's desire to play and the need to play. Now, I will say that now kind of combining a couple things here that you've been talking about in terms of the inherent racism that's built into some of these structures. All of these writers happen to be white, writing about Black athletes, saying they have this need to keep playing despite the risks.
And the majority of their coaches are white too, right? And so I think you have like the need for what? I mean, to die like of a heart attack or to have some thing bad that can happen to you. I think we really have to look at who's making the decisions and are we making the right decisions, especially when you look at how COVID-19 has really exposed, racism, access. I mean, there were Black employees, 70% of essential workers are Black and brown, and most of them are women. There were employees who couldn't even get tested in their own hospitals they worked in because, initially the testing was so disparate. And so I think it really highlights, again, structural racism within the NCAA, if you start looking at coaches, you look at athletic directors and who's making these decisions and what their concern really is. Is it revenue over people? And all I'm saying is, like, let the American Association of Cardiologists give you an evidence-based plan about what should happen. When you follow that and then you clear an athlete, that's one thing. But to quarantine someone and then test negative and then say they're okay to play without doing more rigorous exams that medically we could do, I think, players should start questioning it. And my understanding is some players don't want to play. I mean, we know there's some NFL players who opted out, baseball players who opted out. They're professionals. They're still getting a paycheck. But you talk about what damage could be done to a young athlete at the peak of their career, from a brain perspective or cardiac perspective. And, who's going to ultimately pay for it? And it's going to be, the young man or woman and their family.
And what I've heard over the last few weeks, like similar to what Ricky said, we've seen some of these articles talking about the players needing or wanting to play. But then there's also, you've heard coaches talk about where they feel like their players are suffering a little bit from all the isolation. And I know a few guys that I talked to that were in the bubble. One guy felt like he was a couple of days away from having like a nervous breakdown. The idea of not being able to sort of move. He hadn't been away from his family this long. I think they were like 2.5 months or 3 months away. Mm-hmm. And so, how important is the mental health piece in all of this? Because I know we're concerned about the physical health of these players, but how important is the mental health piece of it?
Yeah, no, it's extremely important. The World Health Organization says there's no physical health without mental health, but I mean, it's your brain that drives everything in terms of your motivation, decisions that you make, how every organ functions. And we know that chronic isolation, chronic loneliness is as big a risk factor as chronic smoking and drinking. So, as human beings, we need social connection, and especially for probably athletes who are in their own bubble anyway, usually outside of a bubble. And so that need to have people who not just tell you how great you are, but also keep you grounded, people who remind you, who may not have any concern for your athletic ability, but are more concerned for you, that they need to touch with. And certainly that includes, partners, spouses, and parents and family. So I think it's been really, really taxing, the same way it's been on individuals who have tried to make sense of this, and then you see others who may be treated differently, or depending on their politics of wearing a mask or how they are, there's just this big discrepancy. So this cognitive dissonance really leads people to think, I'm sacrificing all this for what? And certainly that it taxes, and the main reason it taxes is that it causes anxiety and in some cases depression. And chronic stress and anxiety really is a symptom that can worsen every medical condition. So it's serious. And the other thing I'll say is it's the uncertainty as well. Our brain likes when things are certain. And so in the absence of knowing evidence, in the absence of knowing something certain, our brain will make up a worst case scenario. And that's what leads to so much anxiety. And so, I'll say it. I'm glad we have a new administration that believes in science, and we will get back to evidence, and people will get vaccinated, and really look at the science about what we need to do to keep ourselves healthier. And then people can point to it when they start feeling anxious, and when is this going to end, and feeling uncertain. But whether you're a high-paid athlete, professional, or someone in college, that same level of stress and uncertainty is the same. So it's significant.
And do you think we have an opportunity now, and we've had a few other mental health professionals on the program, and I'll ask you the question that we sort of asked them. Do you think that now is an opportunity that we could work toward destigmatizing some of the conversations around mental health, particularly for young Black athletes? Because, I went through my entire career, and it wasn't until maybe the last 4 years of my entire playing career that mental health sort of came into the conversation. And I had teammates that dealt with stuff. I had stuff that I dealt with and didn't realize what I was dealing with. And then for us growing up, right, usually the person that's like the counselor is like the preacher, right? You go to the minister with all the problems, the family problems, the relationship problems, and not necessarily a mental health professional, somebody who is trained to do it. So do you think this is an opportunity, to sort of have some more evolved and informed conversations, particularly for young Black boys who are told, like, if you're dealing with stuff up here, you're soft. Mm-hmm. If you're emotional, you're weak. If you express yourself, it's seen as a place where someone can attack you at. And I know this, I was told that in sports, like you have to put on this sort of protective front. But I think that with all of the stuff that's going on, I think, we're seriously missing an opportunity to really have some more concise conversations around the mental health of athletes. So where are you at on that?
Yeah, no, I think it's not only an opportunity, it's imperative. And my sense is just like I'm doing the work with Quest Act with these high school students who are both men and girls and boys, definitely people are recognizing that this is the time. And I know for a fact that, professionally and at the college level, even before COVID, people were recognizing they had to do something about that. And so definitely this elevates the conversation. I saw a recent video that Brandon Marshall did, and he talked about the time he took off, football player. I think he played for the Patriots. He was in Boston, I think, and what he had to do and was open about it. So definitely we are losing the stigma. If you look at every business magazine, things online, the mental health of everyone, I think, is really going to be top of mind. But in particular, as you mentioned, David, Black people, Black men, and the Black athletes. So hopefully it will continue and that we will be more comfortable, like actually saying, how are you doing? And not like how many points did you score, but how are you doing? And recognizing the impact that even growing up with a history of trauma, abuse, or what you're exposed to, how if you don't deal with that, it can impact every relationship that you have. So my sense is yes, mental health certainly is top of mind, and younger and younger athletes and people are being exposed to the importance of not just being on top of your game, but being on top of your mental game. So yes.
And broadening it past just athletes for a moment, you've been a contributor on many national shows, CBS This Morning, The Today Show, Good Morning America. On the flip side of what David's been talking about, how important is it also to have the buy-in on the corporate side that this is something we need to focus on and not just a box that we need to check?
Well, I mean, it's extremely important. If you look at the workforce, it's predominantly women. And we know with COVID-19, women who have children under the age of 18, their levels of stress and depression have increased almost 100%. And so companies are recognizing, especially since everybody's pretty much working at home, how burdened their employees are feeling. But at the same time, I mean, a number of companies are making record profits. So it shows that people can work at home, and also do the profits. But how long can that last? So it's really when you are investing in, your people who work for you, then you have to pay attention to, how they're doing, what they say they need more of, giving people time off, because the other burden is being at home. People are managing many things, kids at school, trying to, manage relationships and looking at how it feels to, again, deal with the uncertainty of COVID-19 and then feeling confined. So I think there have been a number of interventions that companies are doing to really listen and to see what they can do to alleviate people's stress, while knowing that just being at home doesn't mean that, you're off. People really having to set up boundaries, again, communicate, figure out how they're doing at work because you're not seeing your supervisors, and also loneliness, just missing like that water cooler talk or for many women, they'll tell me that like going to work was with the time that, they were in the car or on the subway, they could do their own thing, and just finding that time for peace and self-care is really critical.
My wife says that.
Yeah, it's real. It's real.
Given the time of year and the work that you do, I mean, I know that this is one of the heightened risk periods. I mean, I'm here in Cleveland. We're going on I think 10 days without real sun at this point. Is this a time of year where you're busier and you have to deal with more things? Or on the flip side of it with these athletes, because, this is the time of year where a lot of them take off, especially we're seeing now with major collegiate programs that are deciding to let their athletes go home and then come back. So I wonder in terms of the time of year and what people are going to be going through right now with the holidays, the additional stresses and things like that.
I'm smiling, Ricky, because 2020 has been one big drag, or I don't think there's been as many peaks. It's just been one big long, oh my gosh, I can't take any more of this. So I think ordinarily Christmas time does certainly remind people of losses and, anxiety about getting the right thing and all those. But I'm not really finding that. I think because people have been home, and for many people, the upside has been the importance of family and really realizing how many things we do that we don't have to. So my sense is kind of like Thanksgiving was more low key, Christmas will be more low key. Certainly people are missing their grandparents and people that they can't ordinarily see, but there seems to be a little more, less discontent with the holiday season and more just kind of resignation and looking at ways and looking forward to 2021. Now, for athletes going home, I think there's a lot of angst about, again, not wanting to expose grandparents, not wanting to expose family members to whatever, they potentially could bring back, even though they've been tested for COVID. And so again, that speaks to that uncertainty because on the one side, we're playing games and we're not, and then somebody's positive and all that up and down certainly has impacted them. So some athletes, I think, are choosing not to go home at the risk of exposing other people, and that's an individual decision. But my thing is you get tested and you have to proceed as normal as you can. So even being at home, if that means wearing a mask, unless you're eating, still being social distant, it's really important that people connect. So whatever way people feel comfortable doing that, they should do that. And if you recognize like you are just craving, like you literally are dying from not seeing your family, go see your family, but just use common sense. Wear a mask, and don't bring a lot of people into their bubble. But certainly it's a time to reach out and connect, especially if that's what you need.
Just to put a more positive spin on things, obviously the pandemic in 2020 has brought plenty of awful things, but in any ways have you seen things that are going to catalyze positive change coming out of the pandemic?
Absolutely. I mean, the conversations that we're having about white privilege, about the myth of white supremacy, the fact that we know, and not just we know, but like Black Lives Matter. And you can say Black Lives Matter and not have to say Blue Lives Matter, all lives matter. We can say Black Lives Matter because for 400 years they haven't. And then you look at what, people, companies, schools are talking about in terms of educating. I mean, I've talked to so many white families that have their own book clubs where they're reading books, White Fragility, reading How to Be an Anti-Racist, deliberately looking at documentaries and having those conversations. So I certainly think that is an upside, the fact that we're talking about the long history of disparities. And certainly my focus is anti-Black racism. But my point is, as we talk about anti-Black racism, it lifts all marginalized groups up because we all have biases, every single one of us, and we have to look at how we're interacting with people. I think there's been a renewed focus on what's most important to you and the sense of purpose and the importance of family. And I certainly see that as an upside. And the other is just recognizing like how we spend our time, like what we spend on finance. Like people are saving money now because, they're not traveling and they're not just spending things just to make up for whatever they feel like they need to. So I think there's really been a renewed sense of self-awareness and looking at what's most important to you. So certainly I see that as an upside.
All right. I got my last question is typically, it's a question about routine. So for our listeners, young people, I believe that, the sooner we get young people in a routine. I know for me, it was when I went to military school and I was given a routine, how to wake up every day, when to, go stand in the mess hall line, what time to eat. My life changed after getting that kind of regimented routine. So what do you do? What have you done? I mean, you're a doctor, you're successful. You've had a career. So what could you share about, a routine, something you do in the morning that could be a benefit to some young person listening to what we're saying today?
Yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up. I can't say enough about brain health and how our brain is our biggest ally, especially during times like this or any time. So I work out regularly, meditate pretty much every day. And meditation doesn't mean like you have to just stop everything. It's just, even if it's saying a prayer or just allowing yourself to breathe, but certainly focusing on your strengths, which is what meditation allows you to do, and being mindful. Being mindful is not just when things happen and, you don't pay attention to them. You recognize how you're feeling and what you're thinking, you acknowledge it, and then you have the opportunity to shift to something else, to reframe it and make it positive. So for me, it's definitely working out. I mean, I'm not going to lie. I mean, I drink, I like potato chips and French fries. I try to eat better, but I mean, it's things like that really, especially as you get older, you want to be healthier. And a lot of young people aren't thinking like that. But now is the time to institute those healthy habits that can keep your brain and body going so that as you get older, you can make better decisions and have a better life for yourself. Surround yourself with people who support you. Surround yourself with people who ideally are doing better than you're doing and can help you and network. And then I just can't say enough about having a positive attitude. 70% of our thoughts are negative. 70. which means the work is how do you reframe those and change those around? If you look at the media, most of what the media tells us is negative because unfortunately positive things don't sell. So you have to do your own work and read, podcasts like this. Find things that inspire you because often that is the work. And so I think young people just need to know that, to me, millennials, Gen Z, they're the ones who are really leading us in terms of change of thought and really looking at when something happens, saying why is it like this? Questioning it. Keep doing that and forge your own path because the time is ripe right now for a wholesale change. And, paradigms don't shift unless the old one's ready to go. The old one is ready to go. So create a new paradigm for yourself, for your community, and for your culture. And that's the opportunity because we are in uncharted territory. And I think the opportunity is ripe for positive thinking, for positive thinkers, people who are forward thinking, and a real elevation of your own culture personally, and then at the community level.
Wow. Well, Dr. Taylor, that was an awesome answer.
I'm excited actually with what's to come.
Right. Well, we appreciate the time and the thoughtful responses. I will mention, I heard you mention Harlem Hospital. My aunt was a nurse
Oh, really?
at Harlem Hospital for 51 years.
Oh my gosh. Do you know what department she was in?
I do not know.
Okay.
But I know she worked literally because my mom, they were raised in Harlem, moved to Brooklyn, but my aunt worked there from the time she was 16 until she was 67 years old.
Yeah, that's Harlem. People don't leave. But Harlem taught me everything I needed to know about people, about psychiatry, about community. It definitely is one of the best experiences I've had.
Right.
Yeah, I love Harlem.
That's where my mom's from. My grandmother was there. I spent a lot of my time as a young person there. We lived right across the bridge in Teaneck, New Jersey.
Okay.
So
yeah.
I was in New York every weekend until I was 14 or 15.
Yeah, it's a special place. So I raised my girls in Westchester and would drive into Harlem, and people in Westchester and Chappaqua would say, "Oh my gosh, how can you work in Harlem? Aren't you this or that?" And I'd say, "You don't understand. I have a better chance of somebody saying hello, have a nice day in Harlem than I do out here, where people slam the door in your face." At Harlem, people, they were wonderful people. Wonderful people.
Awesome. Well, we really appreciate the time, Dr. Taylor, coming on. And as David said, amazing responses. I think our viewers are definitely going to appreciate them.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the work you guys are doing.